Gold Beach, Jig Sector. 7:25, the 6th of June, 1944. The landing craft carrying the Sherwood Rangers Yeomanry toward the Norman coastline struck a mine on its approach. The hull shuddered. The men on either side of the regimental padre were severely wounded by the concussion before the ramp had dropped. He was moving toward them immediately, gathering up the injured, working out how to evacuate them through the chaos of a vessel still trying to clear the beach obstacles and reach the sand. The beach itself, when the ramp finally went down, was already a working environment. Smoke from vehicles hit during the first wave. The sounds of men carrying equipment across wet sand under fire. German 88mm rounds from positions above the dunes landing intermittently across the surface. Sherwood Rangers Shermans were moving off the beach, those of the DD swimming tanks from A Squadron that had survived the run-in from LCT 1076. C Squadron had lost 5 tanks in the landing alone. The regimental padre moved through this terrain the way he would move through every terrain the following 11 months would produce, with a specific purpose and without waiting for anyone to direct him toward it. His name was Sidney Skinner. He had been born in York on the 26th of November 1911, the son of Sidney Skinner, a barber. He grew up cutting hair on weekends in his father's shop. He became a local Methodist preacher, trained formally for the ministry, and took his first church appointment in North India in 1937, a posting that cut short when his hearing began to fail. Deafness would stay with him for the rest of his life. By late 1942, it had removed him from overseas service. The Royal Army Chaplains Department declared him unfit and sent him home from his posting in Persia, Iraq and Egypt. In March 1944, a medical board passed him fit again and posted him as senior chaplain to the 8th Independent Armoured Brigade, attached to the Nottinghamshire Sherwood Rangers Yeomanry Regiment. The Army's expectation was that he would travel with the regiment's medical officer. He had made different arrangements. Before D-Day, without authorization and without any formal request through the RACHD structure, he had obtained a lightweight motorcycle. His stated purpose: to ensure that no family should suffer the uncertainty of having a relative reported missing. If he could possibly trace that person and, if dead, give them a Christian burial. This wasn't his job as the Army defined it. It had no standing in any regulation. He had decided it was necessary and arranged the means to do it. He splashed onto Gold Beach at 7:25 under fire. He was 32 years old. The Royal Army Chaplains Department had been recruiting Methodist chaplains since 1881. By the Second World War, it administered spiritual care through a ranked structure. Chaplain General at the top, down to Chaplain to the Forces, 4th class, the equivalent of a captain, which was Skinner's working rank throughout the campaign. A doctoral study of the denomination's armed forces history at Durham University identifies Skinner specifically as the first British chaplain ashore on D-Day, and notes his significance within the tradition of Methodist chaplaincy, a tradition that had, from its origins, a greater willingness to give secular help to the army, undertaking welfare and practical tasks beyond formal religious duties. Whether Skinner arrived at his particular self-appointed mission through this denominational habit, or through his own independent assessment of what the regiment needed, isn't recoverable from the record. The outcomes were the same either way. The RACHD's official duties for chaplains in armoured formations included conducting religious services, visiting the wounded, writing to the families of the dead, and providing pastoral support to the living. The official duties said nothing about entering destroyed vehicles to recover what remained of their crews. There was no protocol, there was no training. The chaplain had no authority to direct anyone else to do it, and no official sanction for doing it himself. He did it from D+1 anyway. The Nottinghamshire Sherwood Rangers Yeomanry had been raised as a volunteer hussar regiment in 1794. 2 centuries of territorial soldiering, men from the same county who trained together in summer camps and weekend exercises, and went back to their farms, businesses and professional lives the rest of the year. They had deployed to Palestine in 1940 as cavalry, converted to armour on arrival, trained on American-built M4 Shermans, and returned to England for the invasion. They named their tanks after Robin Hood and his merry men, Maid Marian, Friar Tuck, Little John, others. Call signs drawn from a shared regional mythology, chosen by men who had grown up within 30 miles of each other. Stuart Hills, 20 years old on D-Day, came ashore in a rubber dinghy after his D.D. Sherman flooded on the approach to Gold Beach, arriving after the initial assault with nothing but the clothes he was wearing. His memoir, By Tank into Normandy, published in 2003, follows the regiment through 11 months of combat. It describes the regimental padre appearing throughout those months with one specific, self-imposed task: insisting on recovering all the regiment's dead from knocked-out tanks himself, so that nobody else would have to see what being trapped inside an exploding tank did to a man. Hills was one of the men being protected by that insistence. 40-odd years after the war, writing his memoir, he still knew exactly what he'd been spared. A yeomanry regiment's social texture made the work that Skinner took on not merely difficult, but psychologically impossible to delegate. In a regular army formation, men joined from anywhere in the country and served alongside strangers. In a yeomanry regiment, described by reviewers of Hills's memoir as socially exclusive as the regular in its county composition, the man in the loader's seat might be your neighbour's son. The driver forward might have been at your wedding. His family would ask you what happened. A commanding officer in a regiment like this couldn't, in any practical sense, order a tank crew to go back into the vehicle that had just killed their troop commander and their gunner and their loader. The order had no force, because the men knew exactly who was in there. Skinner understood this before anyone articulated it. The motorcycle gave him independent mobility. Going alone meant no one else would be ordered to assist. A Sherman M4 carried 5 men, commander in the right rear of the turret, gunner directly forward of the commander, loader on the turret's left, driver in the forward left hull, co-driver in the forward right. The tank ran on aviation-grade petrol stored in the sponson racks running alongside the tracks on both sides of the hull. The main gun's propellant charges were stored in the hull as well. When an armour-piercing round, a German 88mm at any practical bocage engagement range, or an anti-tank gun firing from the hedgerow the tank had just come around, penetrated the hull at sufficient velocity, the fuel and propellant could ignite together. British crews called it brewing up. The expression was accurate about the speed. A crew that got out did so in the first seconds, or they didn't. The bocage country south of Bayeux imposed conditions that made this a constant problem. Earth banks topped with rooted hedgerows, some of them centuries old, rising 3 to 5 feet above sunken lanes, worn down by generations of cattle and cart traffic. Fields the size of gardens. Visibility from a Sherman commander's position might be 30 metres in any direction. A German anti-tank gun dug into the far corner of a field, angled to catch a tank at the break in the hedgerow on the approach, could fire and hit before the commander identified anything to fire at. On the close country south of Bayeux in June and July 1944, A Sherman hit by a penetrating round might end up angled against a hedgerow bank with one or more hatches, commanders on the right rear of the turret roof, loaders on the left, hull hatches over the driver and co-driver forward, physically blocked by the earthwork it had just been driving alongside. Skinner was arriving at these vehicles after the fire had burned out, sometimes hours later, sometimes the following morning. A brewed-up Sherman sitting in a Norman hedgerow corner through a July morning. That summer was warm, the fields dry, the heat building early, had been absorbing the sun for however many hours had passed since the hit. The metal works differently in those conditions. His access to each vehicle depended on what had happened to the hatches in the strike and on the tank's orientation when it stopped. He went in alone. The procedure for entering varied. The turret hatches, if they had sprung open under the concussion of the penetrating round or could be forced from outside. The hull hatches, if the tank's position permitted. Once inside, he was working in a space approximately 4 feet across in the turret and narrower in the hull, in partial darkness, since the vehicle's vision ports and hatches were the only light sources, with whatever the fire had left. The 5 crew positions were defined. Commander here, gunner here, loader here, driver here, co-driver here. But the fire wasn't selective. His task was to identify each man by position. That identification was the information the families needed. It was also what made the burial record, each entry accompanied by a hand-drawn diagram relating the grave's location to local landscape features, accurate enough that someone could use it to find the grave after the war. He documented at least one case where no individual recovery was possible. 3 men had melted into the metal of their destroyed tank. He recorded the vehicle's location and moved on. This detail appears in War History Online's coverage of the diary's public release in 2014. The word melted isn't the journalist's rhetorical choice. It's a physical description of a physical fact. Skinner wrote it down because it was what he found, and documentation was the task. He maintained, in addition to the grave diagrams, a complete set of personal details for each man: name, unit, circumstances as recorded. He wrote to the family of every one. Over 150 letters during the Normandy campaign alone. He recorded 153 graves across the full campaign, each with sufficient detail that the Commonwealth War Graves Commission could work from them after the war. Of all the men he shipped out with in June 1944, his own accounting was that the number he couldn't find came to possibly 6 or so. The gap between that number and 153 is the measure of the campaign from his particular position within it. On the 9th of June 1944, D+3, a mortar shell killed Captain Keith Douglas of the Sherwood Rangers near Bayeux. Douglas was 24 years old. He had served with the regiment through the North Africa campaign and written what many now consider the finest English prose account of that fighting, Alamein to Zemzem before Normandy. His poems, Vergiss mich nicht, How to Kill, Aristocrats, are the finest English-language verse to emerge from the Second World War. He was killed by mortar fire 3 days after landing. Skinner dug his grave the same as he dug every other man's grave. The War Zone's academic study, which examines the intersection of Skinner's diary and Keith Douglas's wartime writing, notes that Douglas's body appears in Skinner's narrative as any other man would. A casualty noted, a burial conducted, a location recorded. There is no elevated register for the poet. This isn't callousness, it's the exact quality Semkin later identified in Skinner. His compassion was boundless, practical, and unsentimental. Douglas received what every man in the regiment received: Skinner went back for him, the same as he went back for everyone else. The July 25th diary entry, published by the Regimental Association, opens mid-sequence. After leaving him, I continued following a vehicle track to where an anti-tank gun had been destroyed. It had been set up just like a parade. The text cuts off there in the published excerpt. It's enough to identify the idiom. He has just been with someone. The entry doesn't specify whether the man is alive or dead, and within the same sentence he is noting the formal geometric arrangement of the enemy gun position that produced whatever happened to that man. No grammatical break between the two observations. He moved from one to the next because they were consecutive facts, and he recorded consecutive facts. His diary entry for the 4th of August 1944 is described by a Manchester University press scholar as painting a vivid and visceral process of trying to retrieve bodies from brewed-up tanks. The vivid quality belongs to the subject matter, not to Skinner's rhetoric. What the scholar is responding to is the accumulated specificity of the record. Conditions documented as he encountered them, actions taken as he took them, positions noted as he noted them, in the same flat register that characterises every accessible fragment of the diary from June onward. Sometime in the Normandy period, he and at least one other priest were leading a funeral procession across ground that wasn't yet secured. A German tank was positioned within observation range of the procession. The crew could see what was happening. 2 men in clerical uniform moving across open ground with the dead. They held their fire and let the procession pass. Skinner noted this in the diary and moved to the next entry. July 10th and 11th, 1944. Operation Jupiter. The British Second Army's 8th Corps sent the 43rd Wessex Infantry Division up the slopes of Hill 112 on the morning of the 10th, with the Sherwood Rangers as part of the supporting armour. The hill sits on a low ridge between the Odon and Orne river valleys west of Carr. From its crest in clear weather, an observer can see across the entire bocage landscape, north and west, which is precisely why both sides needed it. German positions on the summit could direct artillery and tank fire across the whole British bridgehead. The hill had been contested since late June during Operation Epsom, fought over, partially taken, largely lost, at heavy cost. Jupiter was the formal attempt to resolve the matter. The 43rd Wessex attacked across the north-facing slopes on the morning of the 10th and made initial gains, pushing toward the tree lines near the crest and toward the village of Esquay-Notre-Dame in the fields below the ridge to the west. By mid-afternoon, the 9th SS Panzer Division had identified the threat and was counter-attacking, reinforced by the 10th SS Panzer Division. The 102nd SS Heavy Panzer Battalion came up to the forward slopes equipped with Tiger IIs carrying 88mm guns that outranged the Shermans supporting the British infantry, capable of penetrating a Sherman's frontal armour at ranges beyond which the Sherman's 75mm gun would even attempt a reciprocal shot. On the close terrain of Hill 112's forward slopes, with the bocage eliminating tactical depth and channeling British armour into predictable lines of advance, this disparity was decisive. On the evening of the 11th, the 4th Battalion Somerset Light Infantry attempted a silent night assault on the crest. German machine gun positions and mortar crews repulsed them before they reached the summit. By the following morning, British forces held the north-facing slopes. The crest remained German. Every major account of the Normandy campaign describes Hill 112 as among its most costly and bitterest engagements. Ground changed hands within hours. Tanks advancing onto the forward slopes in support of the infantry were exposed simultaneously to fire from German armour dug in around the crest and from anti-tank guns positioned to cover the lower approaches. The Sherwood Rangers, as supporting armour, were operating in the conditions that had been killing their crews since D+1. Close terrain, reduced visibility, vehicles moving in predictable directions through predictable gaps. But against heavier opposition and at higher intensity than most of the preceding 6 weeks had produced. The specific text of the diary entries from July 10th and 11th requires the full published edition and the original notebook at the IWM. What is accessible in academic literature and regimental sources gives the July 25th entry and the characterization of the August 4th entry, which bracket the Hill 112 period and establish the diary's register throughout. Operational observation, specific documentation, no commentary on what was being observed. The Hill 112 entries, when the full text is read, appear to cover the same sequence as every other period of heavy contact. More vehicles, more positions noted on more hand-drawn diagrams, more letters written in whatever evening was available. Stuart Hills, whose memoir follows the regiment through exactly this period, describes those July weeks in terms of close engagements and accumulating losses. Of watching friends not return from operations, the maps showed as straightforward. He describes Skinner appearing through these weeks in the same way he appears throughout the memoir, doing the work, not asking for assistance, not reporting it upward, just working. Hill's memoir closes with his own summary of what the 11 months had been. I know that war is a distressing, ghastly, harrowing, horrific, fearsome and deplorable business. How can its actual awfulness be described to anyone? I have done my best. He had watched Skinner describe it throughout. He knew what that description cost. Semken's account of Skinner's stated attitude during his recovery from wounds is unambiguous. His only concern was to recover sufficiently to return to the regiment. He achieved this within 29 days, which placed his return in late July after Operation Jupiter, as the regiment prepared for Operation Bluecoat. Semken describes the means by which Skinner secured an early medical clearance as deceptions best not inquired into. In the language of a former officer writing 40 years later about a man he respected without reservation, that phrase constitutes an endorsement. Whatever Skinner did to get back early, Semken judged it worth recording and worth noting without judgment. During those 29 days, of all the Sherwood Rangers recorded as missing in action in Normandy, all but one were eventually accounted for. The exception was a man who went missing while Skinner was away. When Skinner returned and learned this, his commanding officer had to specifically order him not to venture onto the active battlefield to search. The order was reluctantly obeyed. The physical toll of the sustained work isn't captured in any accessible record from the campaign. No medical notes, no diary passages about his own condition in accessible excerpts. No RMO documents that have reached the public record. The diary maintains its flat operational register from the first entry to the last. What changed externally is visible in the record. At some point during the campaign, the obituary presents this as a general feature of his service rather than locating it at a specific date. The men of the regiment asked that he wear their own shoulder flashes on his chaplain's uniform. He wore them. The RACHD uniform was standard issue, and the shoulder flashes weren't regulation. The Army accepted the arrangement without formal objection, because the arrangement accurately described the functional reality. He was theirs. Not a visiting officer from a brigade headquarters, but theirs specifically, identified as such by the request of the men he was serving. Semkin wrote of him, "His compassion was boundless, practical, and unsentimental." The three adjectives are precisely chosen by someone who had watched the man work for 11 months. Boundless, no limiting condition on who received it or under what circumstances. Practical, expressed through action rather than sentiment. Unsentimental, without the emotional performance that would have been understandable and would have been noticed and would have changed the nature of the work. 3 decorations came from the campaign: a mention in dispatches, the French Croix de Guerre 1940 with palm, and the Belgian Chevalier of the Order of Leopold II with palm. The French and Belgian awards came from the liberation of those countries. None was awarded specifically for the tank work. The work had no official name. Operation Bluecoat in early August opened the breakout the Bocage summer had been building toward. The regiment crossed the Seine at Vernon on the 28th of August 1944. The pursuit northeast through northern France, landscape opening, longer sightlines, the population lining the streets of liberated towns as the Shermans came through, was a different kind of warfare from what the Bocage had produced. The casualty rate dropped. The regiment moved faster. Belgium came next. Brussels, then the Dutch lowlands in September and October. The fighting in the area of the Market Garden corridor. The hard winter along the German border. Early 1945, Germany itself. Through each phase, whenever the regiment lost a tank and there were men inside it, Skinner went back. By VE Day, on the 8th of May 1945, the Sherwood Rangers had accumulated more battle honours than any other single unit in the British Army. The confirmed comparative claim, documented across multiple sources, measuring the range of operations the regiment participated in and the regularity of its deployment. The 153 graves the diary records represent the men whose deaths Skinner personally documented. His own accounting placed the number he couldn't reach at possibly 6 or so. The gap between 6 and 153 is the measure of what 11 months of work in the field produced. The correspondence with families continued after 1945. He had been the one to notify them. Some had written back. Some kept writing for years. He was the only person who could tell them anything the official telegram didn't. Where specifically? How, as much as could be said? What he had found when he arrived. He returned to England in 1945 and back to Methodist circuit ministry. His postings over the following decades moved through Higher Broughton, Whitefield, Altrincham, Stockwell, Chessington and Corby, a normal progression for a working minister across the Midlands and home counties. His final substantive appointment was Superintendent Minister on the Walton and Weybridge circuit in Surrey, a role he held until 1977, after which he continued as a supernumerary minister in Epsom for a further 20 years. He was still preaching in his 80s. Semkin's obituary notes sermons that were always challenging and thought-provoking, and records an excellent bass voice that could lead unaccompanied singing from the front of whatever room he was in. He remained in the Territorial Army alongside all of this. He ended his TA career as Deputy Assistant Chaplain General for the London District, the highest rank a peacetime TA chaplain could hold, with the substantive rank of Lieutenant Colonel. He had entered the RACHD as a wartime captain and stayed in the Territorials for the rest of his working life. He married Etta Atkinson in 1941 after a 5-year engagement that had survived his India posting, the deafness and the removal from overseas service. They had 2 sons, a daughter and 6 grandchildren. He competed in cricket, football, rugby union and rugby league. He had swum for York as a young man. In retirement, one of his regular pleasures was attending matches at Lord's. There is no record in any accessible source of press interviews, lectures, or public accounts of what he had done between June 1944 and May 1945. The men of the regiment knew because they had been there. The families he had written to knew because they had received the letters. Beyond those two groups, the work wasn't a subject he raised. The diary was privately published under the title The Man Who Worked on Sundays, the Personal War Diary of the Reverend. Sidney Skinner, RACHD, Chaplain, 8th Armoured Brigade, attached Sherwood Rangers Notts, Yeomanry Regiment. The IWM catalogue records the publisher as Plus Printing for the author, and the place of publication as Stoneleigh, Surrey, consistent with the area of Skinner's ministry and retirement in his later years. For the author means what it says. He published it himself, without a commercial press, without literary distribution. Catalogue records give 1997 as the publication year. Skinner died on the 9th of October 2001, aged 89. He had been alive for 4 years after the diary appeared in print. The title he chose is its own description. Sunday was the day the dead needed burial, regardless of what else was happening. It was also a working day for a chaplain when the army was fighting. The title accounts for both conditions, without dramatising either. A separate prior disposition is recorded on the rear cover of the printed edition. The original handwritten wartime notebook of this diary is deposited with the Imperial War Museum. The IWM catalogues it as Object LBY 92/2420. Two objects then, the printed book and the original notebook, in different institutions, both physically existing, both accessible. He arranged the IWM deposit himself. In 2014, around the 70th anniversary of D-Day, the diary's journals were placed on public display at the Normandy Experience Museum in Cambridge. The War History Online coverage from May 2014 describes the event and quotes the diary directly. This was the first time most people outside the regiment and the academic specialists who had been citing it in their footnotes had any opportunity to encounter the text. Semken, writing in the Guardian obituary published on the 21st of November 2001, described the diary as one of the most vivid and illuminating of all war memoirs. He had served alongside Skinner for 11 months. The description isn't a dust jacket endorsement. It's a judgment from someone with the standing to make it. The academic world found the diary gradually and independently. A doctoral dissertation on British treatment of the war dead in northwest Europe between 1944 and 1951, held at ProQuest, cites it alongside Anthony Cotterell's war reports as primary documentation of the immediate post-D-Day period. A Manchester University Press monograph on death and grief in wartime Britain draws on it across 3 separate chapters: on dying, on burial, and on grieving. 3 different analytical frameworks arriving at the same source independently. A 2019 article in a military history journal places it at the centre of an argument about how Britain recorded and valued its war dead. James Holland's regimental history, Brothers in Arms, the most recent major account of the Sherwood Rangers, drew on it as a primary source. Stuart Hill's memoir had done the same a decade earlier, confirming from a participant standpoint what Skinner recorded from his own. These are uncoordinated uses, accumulated over the years the diary was quietly in print. Nobody ran a campaign to establish its importance. Historians working independently on different questions kept arriving at the same document because it's the only first-person, operationally specific, sequentially dated account of the work it describes, in the exact language Skinner chose to describe it, starting from D+1 and running through to VE Day. Accounts associated with the diary's publication history, passed through family and through those connected to the privately printed edition, hold that Skinner had asked for the diary to be destroyed, and that it wasn't. These accounts aren't confirmed in any official record, in the IWM catalogue, or in the Guardian obituary. But the privately printed edition does exist. The original notebook does sit at reference LBY 92/2420. Someone made a decision to preserve it rather than destroy it. The Sherwood Rangers Yeomanry Regimental Association still meets. They have conducted battlefield tours to Normandy and northwest Europe since 1994. Men and their descendants walking the same ground the regiment fought over, following the same routes the Shermans took through the bocage toward Bayeux, toward Hill 112, toward the Seine and beyond. Their social media presence publishes diary entries on anniversary dates. The July 25th entry appears. The 6th of June is marked. September crossings into Belgium. On the 9th of October each year, they post his name with 2 words, loyal unto death. Leslie Skinner died on the 9th of October 2001, aged 89. He had been in active ministry since his first appointment in North India in 1937. 64 years from that posting to his supernumerary years in Epsom. 11 months of those 64 years he spent doing work that had no official name and no place in any regulation. He spent the remaining 56 on circuits and territorial service and cricket at Lord's and letters that kept arriving from families he had written to in Normandy. The original handwritten notebook is at the Imperial War Museum, reference LBY 92/2420, in his own hand. 164 pages, 153 graves. He asked for it to be burned. It wasn't. Subscribe for more stories like this.